It's a nice warm day outside and the sun is shining. Was definitely a praise the last couple days. We actually had good weather for the Athens street fair downtown. The last couple times that we've tried to do anything outside, it seems like we've had a thunderstorm. We had a thunderstorm for the Arts Fest over here, and then our church picnic we were going to do outside, and it rained on us that day too, so it was really, really nice to be able to actually have some good weather last couple days and to be able to be out at the Athens Street Fair, and another nice day today, incidentally, as well. Looking in Ephesians chapter 6, the next few verses here, we're going to be going verses 5 through 9 this morning, so still fewer verses than what we would normally do, but the topic is so succinct here that I wanted to be able to cover just this particular topic that it covers. We've been talking about the paragraphs that follow a phrase that is given in chapter 5 in Ephesians in verse 21. That phrase is submitting to one another in the fear of God. That is the heading of what follows after that. It is under that we have the discussion of the marriage relationship. Wives, submitting and respecting your husbands, but husbands, laying your life down in sacrificial love for your wife. That's an attitude of submitting one to another there in those given roles as husband and wife. What we covered last week was the parent-child relationship. How do we submit ourselves or sacrifice ourselves one to another in a parent-child relationship? Children are to obey and honor their parents. We found that the obedience to parents is not necessarily equivalent with honoring your parents, because honoring your parents even means, when you're older, providing for their needs as they get older. That's part of honoring your parents that Jesus talks about and rebukes the scribes and Pharisees for neglecting when he was there. So honoring them, being obedient to them, and then obviously the parents not provoking their children to wrath. You're a representative of the love of God. Do not represent God to a way that would push your children away from the authority of God. Be the kind of loving authority that will drive them to love authority and thus love God as an authority. Don't provoke them to wrath. Bring them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. Still under that heading of submitting one to another, we have a new topic of discussion. And I want you to look just in verse 5 of chapter 6. And what is the very first word there that you have? Typically it's either bondservants or slaves, okay? So understand that slaves here as a bondservant would be someone that actually willingly chose to put themselves into servanthood. Perhaps it was instead of paying a massive debt and being sent to prison or something of that nature. But there is a willingness to be there, but it is really a willing slave because they're not being paid for their work. It's there. Now, so really it's a discussion of their culture's version of slavery, okay? That's what we're talking about. I think there have been a few fundamental preachers in years gone by that have falsely used this passage to justify slavery. And it does in no way justify slavery. Specifically the slavery that occurred in the United States. Slavery that occurred in the United States, number one, was drastically different from this kind of slavery, and this passage doesn't even promote this kind of slavery. It simply teaches how to operate within the culture that already existed. Does that make sense? This is not promoting this. This is teaching how to operate in it. In fact, even in a discussion of slavery, if we're going to talk about the kind of bondservants or slaves that existed then, what's the biggest difference between the husband-wife relationship or the parent-child relationship and that of a master-servant relationship? What's the biggest difference that you could think of? What's that? Sure, okay, it certainly might not be love. so it might not fall into the category of loving. There's no blood relationship. Sure, we're not talking about family anymore, so that's a pretty big difference, isn't it? Think about this. Who set up the husband-wife relationship? Who set up the parent-child relationship? Who set up the slave-master relationship? Man. When we think of who ordained marriage, God did. Who instructed how to be married and what marriage should look like, God did. Who gave you your parents? You certainly didn't. God gave you your parents. Who gave you your children? God did. All of these things we think of as being ordained or put into place by God. When we get to this passage, something dramatically changes because all of a sudden we get to a relationship that was created by man. And then there's authorities that are outside of our family, authorities that maybe for very worldly causes are now in authority over us, and it's not necessarily any, can I say, what we would consider a God-given cause that they're in authority over us. What do we do with these kind of relationships? Now, today, thankfully, we don't have the issue of slavery any longer. I'm exceedingly thankful that that is a battle that we don't have to fight today, okay? I know some places they're still fighting that battle, and I can't wait until it's just done away with, completely and totally. But what are other human authorities that we would not think of as necessarily as God ordained as what marriage or family would be? What are some of those kinds of authority relationships that we could think of that would be practical for us today? Okay, job related. You know, if you have a boss, did God in Scripture tell you you're going to have this boss? Did God give you the boss or did the company hire him? We tend to think of it as, well, the company hired him, and we hope they fire him soon. That's the way we kind of tend to think about that, right? It was the company's fault that I have this boss. Or maybe it's the company's fault that you have this particular employee that you have to deal with day in and day out. Maybe that's your side of the equation. So certainly the workplace can be a place where there is an authority structure there, but that we would consider it a little more man-made than God-ordained. How about maybe a classroom setting? Whenever someone's taking a class, who has the authority in the room? The teacher has the authority in the room. Now, someone could argue that you get to pick your teacher because you get to pick the school and this kind of thing. I suppose so, but even then it would be one of those situations where does a teacher end up being sometimes who you think they were at the beginning? Sometimes you hear really great things about a teacher and you get in the middle of the class and you're going, I wish I could get out of this. I wish I could just get rid of this, right? It's a little more man-made. The structure is put together a little more by man in a classroom setting. How about government? You realize there's no God-ordained form of government? You know, I know that we're all Americans and we're like, republic, democracy, yes, Western world, go. But you know what eternity is going to be ruled by? A dictatorship. You know, a dictatorship is a really great form of government. You just have to have a good dictator. So when Jesus is the dictator, everything will be great. Right? It'll be wonderful. And just like you can have a bad dictator, if you have bad representatives in a republic, guess what happens to the government? It goes downhill just like it would if you had a bad dictator and it was a dictatorship. The problem is not the form of government, the problem is what? People. We are the problem. Man's sinful nature. So government, whenever someone crafts a constitution or puts something together, is that God ordained or is that something that probably some pretty smart guys put together? And it's kind of man-made. Man creates this thing or this way of working together, and they create an authority system Are speed limits inspired? Yes? No? Well, they change all the time, so if they're inspired, then that means that something changed. Things are man-made. So here's some different practical examples, and Paul here is dealing with his current day example of what it is like to live under what he would consider like a man-made authority and servanthood. And I think we can take some of these principles and apply them to all of these things. We can apply them to how we interact with government and the laws that the government has given to us and that authority structure there. We can apply them to a classroom setting. If you're in a class or you're in school, how do you interact with your teacher? How do you do that? If you're a teacher, how do you interact with your class? How do you live in those kinds of situations, even at work, with bosses or employees? How do you live there with the understanding that we're to submit to one another? How does that play out? Let's get into the text and see what Paul has to say related to slaves and masters, but let's us think some of these other examples of how we might do this with other man-made authorities. The first people he talks to is those under authority. Isn't it interesting? In this passage, he spends verses 5 through 8 really talking to the people that are under the authority, and then he reserves one verse to talking to the person who's in authority. Why do you suppose that is? Do you find it as a human being easier to be the authority or to be under the authority? To be the authority. There's a natural desire to be the authority, right? There's always that natural desire to be the authority. And it's difficult when you're dealing with situations where you actually have to be under the authority. So he's going to spend the first bulk of the text in that realm. But I would also say this, even in any of your personal lives, is there more areas of life in which you are the authority or more areas in life in which you're under authority? And I think that even the CEO of a company has more areas in life in which he's under authority, whether that's the authority of God directly or the authority of his church or the authority of the government. He's under much more authority than he is in authority. Does that make sense? And that's the way we typically find ourselves. And so there's more instruction there. The very first thing that Paul says here is he tries to drive home this point of being sincere in submitting to human authority. He uses this concept of submitting from the heart or being sincere in your submitting from authority in the first few verses here, and he says it in a couple different ways. Let's first look at verse number 5 in chapter 6. Bondservants, be obedient to those who are your masters according to the flesh, with fear and trembling, in sincerity of heart as to Christ. So first, the command is that you're to obey your human authority as you would Christ. Your human authorities, and he adds there, in the flesh, the idea that this is a very human authority. Obey them as you would Christ. And what does he say there? Obey them sincerely, out of sincerity of heart, as you would Christ. What does that look like, and why is it that Paul takes the idea of obeying with sincerity and he says, as you would Christ? Can you think of some examples of some human authorities that maybe you know of or maybe have even been under that it would be very difficult to obey with any amount of sincerity? That truly wanting to please that authority just really never crossed your mind. Maybe that was birthed out of, for a long time, trying to please that authority and it never working. They're never happy. And so Paul says here, but serve your human authorities as you would serve Christ, because if you're serving them and thinking I'm serving Christ, and that's in your brain, is that going to produce a sincerity of heart in your work? Absolutely. And so we need to serve human authorities as we serve Christ. We need to obey them as we would obey Christ. What does that mean for people sitting in a classroom? And the teacher says, no talking. That's exactly what it means. It means nobody talks. It means obedience, because I'm to obey that human authority as if Christ gave me that command. Does that seem a little strong to you? And yet that is what Paul is saying here. What does it mean for the workplace? Maybe you've been doing a certain job a certain way for years, and the new boss comes by and says, you know, I'd like you to do this a little differently. I'd like you to do it this way instead. Okay, thanks, bye. And continues walking. What are you supposed to do? Obey that human authority as if he was Jesus. Now, we all know he's not. We all know that he has plenty of flaws that I'm sure if I asked you about, you could start listing them off. But to live in submittance to one another, we are to obey the human authority as if he was Jesus. So obey him as you would obey Jesus. What does it mean for government? When the speed limit on 220 is 55 miles an hour, what speed is Jesus going to hold you accountable for? 55 miles an hour. Is that strange to anybody? Does that seem weird? You know, when you're supposed to report certain incomes on your taxes for the government to make sure the right amount was taken out and you were taxed the right amount, and you know how to kind of get around it, or we just won't talk about that extra $2,000 that came in this year. What do we call that? Stealing. And we're to submit to human authority how? And we're to obey human authority how? As if it was Jesus telling us that. Right? And frankly, in the grand scheme of things, as far as Jesus is concerned, how much is $2,000? Nothing. $2,000 is not going to matter for eternity. So why is it that big of a deal? Obey our human authorities in verse 5. In verse number 6, he continues here, and he begins to get beyond just the outward workings of what we're doing and starting to deal with the heart here. He says, not with eye service as men pleasers, but as bondservants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart. So realize that he started talking and using this example of bondservants and masters, and he says, instead of thinking yourselves as a bondservant to whoever your master is, think of yourself as a bondservant to who? So he says, in your mind, replace the one that has authority over you with Jesus. And obey as if that's Jesus. He says, don't do it to please whoever your boss is. Okay, don't obey the speed limit to please President Trump. He won't be impressed. He probably doesn't care, honestly. Obey the speed limit as if you're obeying Jesus. Obey the teacher in the classroom, not because you love this teacher and she's your favorite ever. Obey this teacher as if it's Jesus standing up there and teaching. Obey your boss at work. If you obey and you're motivated by trying to please your boss, what does that mean? You're seeking the praise of man. That's one thing, right? You're looking for that praise of man. If you're looking to please your boss at work with what you're doing, you're looking for the praise of man. You are going to keep working or stop working when they're not around. Maybe work a little less, so that when he comes back you can still say you got something done. But certainly it's going to change the way you work when they're not looking over your shoulder, right? And it becomes a heart attitude here. Not just, I'm supposed to obey human authorities, so therefore I'm going to obey human authorities. It's, in what manner are you going to obey the human authorities? Are laws and rules and commands ever more there at certain times than others? No, the command is always there. On 220, is the speed limit always 55? I mean, unless you go further south where it's not, okay? But yes, the speed limit is always there. Now, some people think that the speed limit is only 55 when there's a cop car, sitting on the side of the road, right? You see, the cop car doesn't change the existence of the command. It just makes you feel the presence of the authority. And when you feel the presence of the authority, what does it make you do? You're checking your speed like every 3 seconds, right? You're trying to slow down without hitting your brakes because if they see you hit your brakes, they might come after you, That's what you're doing. Obeying human authorities as if you would obey Jesus, and how present is Jesus with you? Always. And so having a consistency will result. Don't work for man's praise. The implication here is, whose praise are you working for, if not man's? Christ's, God's praise. That's why you work. And we'll see that in verse 7, continuing on here. With goodwill, doing service as to the Lord and not to men. Who are we serving? Jesus. We're serving Jesus. Does that mean the person who's working in the welding shop, welding on someone's tractor? He's not working for that guy. Who's he working for? Jesus. Does that seem strange? Sometimes we get this idea that, you can have a regular job or you can be in ministry. But what does this text say? We're all working for who? Jesus. We're all working for Jesus. Whatever job we have, whatever classroom we're in, whatever government authority we have over us, we ought to serve them as if we're serving Jesus, for so we are. Not for the sake of what men will see of us and the praise we would get from them, but as to the Lord, not to men. We don't look for men to give us a reward. We look to Jesus. Verse number 8 kind of sums up here these concepts. In verse number 8 it says, knowing that whatever good anyone does, he will receive the same from the Lord, whether he is a slave or free. He says, you are going to be held accountable for what? For your service. For what you do. The way you respond to authority, you're going to be held accountable for that. Not just direct authority from God, but even the authorities that through the culture that you're in, you've been placed under, whether that be classroom or government or your boss at work. You're going to be held accountable for those things. And ultimately, who do we all give account to? We all give account to God. We all give account to Jesus Christ. It doesn't matter if you're the President of the United States. Who do you give an account to? God. And I think sometimes a more weighty account because of the authority that he has, right? He's going to have to give an account for what he does with his authority. Just like you, if you have any kind of authority, whether that's even just a parent or a husband in a home as the leader of the household, that's a weighty thing because you're going to give an account of how you led your children, your family. If you're a boss at work, you're going to give an account as well before Jesus. And so Paul kind of seeks to slightly even the playing fields here, because who is the master of the slave, really? Christ is. Who is the master of the human master here? Christ is. And so this stops being as much a master-slave relationship, and it begins to equalize the playing field. Why? Because they're both slaves to the same master. They're both under the one great authority, which is God. How do we view that in our authority that we have here on the earth, the authority structures that man has set up? And this is where we get into verse 9 and start talking about how we should have authority there. Springing right off of the idea that we will all answer to God, and so we should serve as if we were serving Christ. He says in verse 9, "And you, masters, do the same things to them." And let's just stop right there for a minute. We've just talked about how if you're under authority, you should submit as to Christ. You should obey as if you're obeying Christ. You should be fine with being under this human authority as if you're serving God, because we're all serving God, ultimately. And then he says to the person in authority, and by the way, you do what? You do the same thing. Does that seem backwards? The one who has authority. Now, does he have any less authority because of this phrase? No, it's not that he has less authority, but what is he supposed to do? How is he supposed to use that authority? In a way of sacrificial service to those that are under him. Why? Because as one slave of Christ to another slave of Christ, he's going to lead them by serving them. This is what the same kind of concept that Paul talks about at the end of chapter 5 when he says, "Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself for her." Lay down your life for your wife. That's important. Be willing to sacrifice everything you are for the good of your wife. He says this to children. Parents, don't exasperate your children. Don't provoke them to wrath. Use your authority to teach them to love God, to bring them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. Love them. You know, is teaching them to love God and the way you need to interact with them to teach them to love God, is that sometimes a little more time-consuming and inconvenient than get over here and sit right there and just be quiet? That's the quick fix, isn't it? What did I teach them about loving God? I taught them to resent authority, maybe, which is actually a negative if I'm trying to teach them to love God. I need to have a conversation with my child and say, you know, you did this, and can you explain this to me? Why? And how does that correlate to the authority that God has put in your life? And how are you showing honor as God has taught you to show honor to authority? How is that? Is that going to take more time? That's inconvenient. But we need to be able to sacrifice ourselves for the good of our children. We may get what we want really quick by just telling them to sit down and be quiet. But we need to take the time and sacrifice ourselves for the good of them. The same type of relationship and the same thing that he demands of authority in both the husband-wife relationship and the parent-child relationship, he demands again in the human relationship with human authorities here in the slave-master relationship, and that is to give yourself to the people under you. Serve them. The same way that they are to serve you, you serve them. You demonstrate, you show them how service is supposed to go by doing it and enacting it. Continuing on, giving up threatening, knowing that your own master also is in heaven and there is no partiality with him. Don't use your authority position to threaten or cause them to fear. Isn't that the natural human tendency to use authority? We're going to scare them into doing what we want. If you don't do that, you're going to be fired. If you don't do that right now, boy, you're going to get a whooping. The fear tactic is overwhelmingly used by humans. We naturally go there. We try to scare people into doing what we want them to do. God says, don't do it. Don't use it to be threatening. Don't cause them to fear. Why? You don't need to threaten them. Is it your place to threaten? No, it's your place to lead. That's different. Teach them to love God. Why? Because we both answer to God at the end of verse 9, knowing that your own master also is in heaven and there is no partiality with him. Does he see you two, whether you have authority or you're under the authority, does he see you two as being different value? Does he like one of you better? There is no partiality. He sees you as equals, and so, as someone who has authority in the way the human culture has set things up, you need to see that equality and let that be very obvious in the way you lead. Don't let the way you lead make people think that you believe that you're somehow better than they are. Let the way you lead emphasize the fact that we all answer to God. I'm just trying to teach you how to do that. To teach you how to live like that with that healthy respect for who God is. We all answer to God. He doesn't show partiality. God does not see one of you as better than the other, and you should act upon the equality with which God sees you. All of these things they're so incredibly applicable in all of these commands, it's very difficult to draw any further direct application from them. What are some areas in which we struggle with this concept, though? Do you realize that by nature of having a sin nature, we're all natural-born rebels against authority? And it doesn't just come out in rebelling against God by sinning. We're all natural rebels against all authority. You know, it's the surest way to sometimes get a child to realize there's a cookie jar in the room. Tell them not to touch it. And all of a sudden, the presence of that cookie jar is overwhelmingly obvious to them every second. And it's like, I probably just shouldn't have said anything. There's a natural bent to buck authority. You're telling me what to do. Don't tell me what to do. You don't have authority here. You're not supposed to be. We all naturally buck against authority. We have a harder time with that. And as an authority in whatever place that God has placed us in, because ultimately, even within these human cultural authority structures, who ultimately is in control? God, right? And so who put you in your spot? Even if it was your decision to take the job, and even if it was the company's decision to hire your boss and all those things, who put you there ultimately? God did. Because he controls the end from the beginning. And so we need to obey because God has put us where we're at. We need to have that obedience. And if we have that authority in whatever area it is, do we act with that authority to cause fear in the people under us? Do we act in that authority that would be authoritarian? Or do we act in that authority that would be a loving, servant-led leadership to say, we need to go towards Christ. It's going to hurt when sin is pointed out. It's going to hurt when things are corrected. There's going to be some tension there. Any authority structure is like that. But a good leader is willing to do that for the sake of pointing people towards Christ. And that's where we need to go, with both human authority and authority that we have around us in the world. Realizing that God ordains even human authority. So as we go from here, as we go about our week this week, whether it's at the workplace, whether or not it's in the classroom with teachers, probably not right now because it's summertime, but whether or not it's the speed limit on 220 or whatever other government-imposed regulation is out there that you find yourself up next to this week, obey. There's an old kid's song, O-B-E-Y, obey always. If you've worked in junior church, you probably know that one. It's such a simple concept that how many parents wish their kids would learn to obey perfectly? How many parents wish that your kids would obey better than you currently obey? And now we know where the problem is, right? We all need to be obedient people. We all need to learn to submit ourselves one to another, and part of that is just looking at the authority structures that God has given and saying, I will submit myself to that. I will submit myself to that. These are the things that I am to live under, and God has put me here, so I will submit myself to that. And we need to do so joyfully, not as being pleasing to men, not just in the sight of men, but as we're serving Christ and keeping Jesus as the one that we're ultimately serving in any area of authority. Let's pray. Lord, we thank you for your word. We thank you for these sections of your word specifically that are just immensely practical, that certainly are not a joy for us to hear sometimes because they rub us the wrong way. They step on our toes. They're things that we don't like hearing about. God, we are not a submissive people, and yet you've commanded us to be, and you've wanted us to be so much that you've gone beyond just telling us to submit to one another and given us very specific examples on how to do that and how that's played out. I pray that as we've looked at how that is done in human authorities this morning, that we would better be mindful of your ever-presence with us this next week, that we would serve our authorities as we would serve you in that position because you've put us there, and that we would see any authority that we have as an authority that is bestowed from you, and so that we are to utilize that in the right way, in the way in which you use your authority through Christ in servant leadership. I pray these things in your name. Amen.